Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for session 4 of our 5-part series on the expansion competition. I won't be long, but just a quick reminder that we will end up our cycle tomorrow afternoon talking about how to submit your application in eGrants. Without further ado, I will hand it off to my wonderful colleague, Tracy, to tell us about best practices in budget development. Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anne. Hello, and thank you for joining this Best Practices in Budget Development webinar for the AmeriCorps Seniors FY 2021 FGP SCP Expansion Competition. My goal for today's session is to help you, the foster grandparent or senior companion expansion program applicant, acquire the knowledge and skills you need to understand the function of and to develop an effective FGP or SCP budget and budget narrative. Your submission of a complete and high quality budget will help to demonstrate that you have the fiscal capacity to manage an FGP or SCP program. During this session, I will holistically review the components of an FGP and SCP budget, which are identical in design and include both AmeriCorps resources and the applicant's matching resources. And at the end of the webinar, you should understand how to determine if the costs are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable as determined by 2 CFR 200, which is the Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. And you'll often hear that referred to as the Uniform Guidance. If you use this information and the tips and practices that I share today, you should be prepared to submit a compliant and competitive budget. Because the budget and budget narrative becomes part of the grant recipient's contract with AmeriCorps, we want and we expect applicants to present a strong and accurate document. The approved budget not only serves as a financial guide for grant-supported activities, but it helps to ensure the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping AmeriCorps monitor grant and financial compliance, it can serve as a tool for both AmeriCorps and award recipients to measure progress toward the match requirements and monitor budgeted expenses to actual expenses as part of your budget management process. Before we dive into the details of budget development, I want to point out that budget development is just one component of an effective budget management process. So let's take a quick look at the full process. As you started to work on your FGP or SCP application, you may have asked yourself, how do I design a strong budget? Whether you actually started the process with that question or not, as part of the pre-award project development process, it's likely that your team already determined the needs that you wanted to address with FGP or SCP resources. And then you set up program or project goals and objectives, and you decided on a strategy to accomplish those goals. To develop the budget, applicants must then translate that strategy into dollars to prepare a budget that's aligned with the stated program goals and objectives. Post-award, after you get your funding from AmeriCorps Seniors, grantees then continue to manage their budgets effectively by establishing a budget control process, by monitoring expenses, that is, regularly comparing your budgeted to actual expenses to check for over and underspending, and then modifying your budget as necessary with approval from AmeriCorps when required. Today's conversation will focus on the budget preparation process. So let's talk about an approved budget. It should be realistic. That is, it should reflect expected program revenues and expenses and its capacity to carry out program activities. It should be consistent and aligned with the program goals and objectives, and it should be flexible. A project's financial and operating circumstances often change, and the budget must adapt to those changing circumstances. For now, we will focus on the realistic and consistent features as they relate specifically to budget design. Now, a few minutes ago, I outlined the steps that your team may have taken as part of the budget development process. The term team was very intentional on my part. AmeriCorps encourages applicants to approach budget design as a team activity, engaging various departments based on their individual expertise. For example, human resources may have salary, fringe, and criminal history check costs. The program office may know the cost for training, evaluation, and delivering services to the community. The accounting office will have historical spending rates for specific costs. The grants office should certainly be able to review your application for compliance, and other staff may have additional expertise and can review the budget for clarity. Now, I do realize that if you're a part of a small organization, you may not have all these resources available to you, but you still should not undertake budget development in a vacuum without input from others. Don't be afraid to involve as many other people as is required to present the most realistic data in the budget and make sure that the document aligns with your programmatic goals and objectives. You may also want to have someone outside of your budget development team look at that budget to make sure that the content is clear and accurate. AmeriCorps recommends that applicants use historical information when possible. And as a reminder, your accounting department should have that kind of information. And then you would just adjust it as necessary so that the data is more timely. And then you can include that information as appropriate as part of your budget narrative description. Your strong budget design provides a framework for effective budget management, and it ensures a realistic scope, appropriate detail, a competitive proposal, compliance, and effective delivery. That is, it serves as a guide for your program implementation. So in order to create a budget that is strong, accurate, and requires minimal clarification, I encourage you to take your time and engage others in both the data collection and quality review. As I previously stated, one of the objectives for this session is to provide you with tips and tools for creating a competitive budget narrative. The first tip is to read and follow the instructions in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, from here on referenced as the NOFO, and in the application instructions. The strongest and most compliant budget narratives adhere to these guidelines, and that saves all of us time and effort later. These documents provide specific details that are related to budget compliance, including various required costs. Now, I do share this guidance with a caveat. We recently discovered that the original application instructions included some incorrect guidance on the process for providing federally negotiated indirect cost rate details to AmeriCorps and the current annual stipend amount for volunteers. So I will highlight these errors with the correct information as I go through the webinar content. Additionally, I will encourage you to review the most current version of the application instructions and compare that with what you're submitting in your application budget. And as a reminder, those instructions are available on the AmeriCorps website. I also encourage you to become familiar with the uniform guidance and only include those costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. And you can find the uniform guidance online at ecfr.gov and look under Title II, Grants and Agreements. After you and your team estimate the financial resources you need to achieve the stated program goals, you will organize them into the narrative's budget categories, again, following the guidance in the NOFO and the application instructions. As you develop the narrative, please remember to provide adequate descriptions and clear calculations. eGrants will automatically populate a budget summary and a budget narrative report that should be able to serve as a standalone document without a need to reference the application narrative for explanation. And that's where the suggestion to have someone outside the budget development team review the document to check for holes and inaccuracies comes in handy. We also often like to, in our office, refer to this as the mom test. You know, give it to your mom or somebody else that has no idea what you do in your normal day And if they can understand what's in that budget, then it's probably a pretty clear standalone document. The uniform guidance specifies costs considered unallowable, such as lobbying, entertainment, and alcoholic beverages. AmeriCorps strongly encourages your applicants to review those uniform guidance unallowable costs so that you avoid including those in your proposed budget. Other unallowable costs include those that are not necessary to meet program objectives. For example, budgeting new laptop computers for each of your organization's 8 staff members might seem like a great idea, but you wouldn't include computers for all 8 staff members if only 2 staff are included in the budget. That's not allowable, and it could be considered waste, fraud, or abuse. Another example is budgeting $4,000 for a top-of-the-line desktop computer with all kinds of fancy accessories and peripherals for an employee who's going to primarily use a word processing program and email. These are costs that would be considered unreasonable from a prudent person perspective, or they just have no logical basis for inclusion in this budget. The minimum match requirement for FGP and SCP applications is 10% of the total project costs. This graphic shows what the budgeted 10% grantee share would look like for a grant with a total program budget of $100,000. In this example, the grantee share of $10,000 meets that 10% requirement. Now, as you know, AmeriCorps waived the match requirement for this program year after issuing the NOFO. So while this requirement appears in the NOFO and the application instructions, applicants will not be held to the standard. However, we do encourage you to show how you will support your program. So when you are able, you will show that support by entering the information in the grantee share of the budget. It's important to remember that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or your required match. Additionally, cash and in-kind contributions are acceptable as match when they are necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of project or program objectives, when they are allowable under the uniform guidance and the application instructions, when they are included in the approved budget and allocable under program guidelines, when they are compliant with the terms and conditions of the award and the uniform guidance, and when they are verifiable from the organization's records. The matching resources must be treated the same as the AmeriCorps share, and consistent treatment includes complete and accurate documentation. A frequently heard phrase in the world of grants management is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So please make sure to document all of your expenses. In order to fully demonstrate a plan for your non-AmeriCorps support, applicants are required to include the source of matching funds in the budget narrative, entering the description of the source along with the amount, a cash or in-kind classification, the type of match source, that is, whether it's state or local government, federal funds, or private donations, and confirmation of whether the sources of match are secured or proposed, as noted in the NOFOs. And you do not need to secure 100% of your match prior to submitting the application. You may enter anticipated match by noting that it is proposed. And whether secured or proposed, the total in this section must equal the amount of match shown in the budget. Exactly. As you enter data in your budget, you will notice that the structure includes both the AmeriCorps and the grantee share of project costs, and that the grantee share is identified in eGrants as the CNCS share. Additionally, the budget is divided into 2 different sections. Section 1 is for volunteer support expenses, which includes both direct and indirect cost categories. The direct costs in this section include grant-related program operating costs. Specific line items may include those shown on this slide. This section may also include general or centralized organizational expenses that are spread across the entire organization as indirect cost. And section 2 of the budget is for volunteer expenses. As the section heading states, this includes all reimbursable expenses incurred for the FGP and SCP volunteers during the course of grant-related activities, rather than those costs that are related to program operations. It includes a category for stipends and a category for other volunteer costs, including those shown on the slide. As you, the FGP or SCP applicant, develop your budget management systems and specifically the budget control process, you'll want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking and documenting all of these expenses. Before we go into the specifics of the budget, I just want to pause for a moment and check with Ann to make sure there are no questions pending.
No questions at this time.
Okay, perfect. Then let's dig into what is in the budget itself, looking at the specific budget categories and the related guidance in the 2021 AmeriCorps Seniors Application Instructions. And you may even want to pull up a copy of that and follow along as I go through the budget with you. We're going to begin with Section 1, the volunteer support expenses. And in Section 1A, that is the personnel expenses, you will individually list each staff position supported by the grant and provide the annual salary and the level of effort as a percent of full-time employee devoted to this award, or if it's calculated on an hourly basis, the hourly rate and the number of hours per week that that employee will generally work. Please remember to only include positions that are supported by the application narrative, and make sure not to include the value of direct community service provided by volunteers unless it's for organizational functions such as accounting or auditing or training, if you've got someone who's providing those services to you as an in-kind donation. In addition, if you have multiple AmeriCorps grants, it's a good idea to confirm that you are not over budgeting, that is, including more than 100% of staff time on your budgets. And you can do this by including a statement in each line or at the end of the section that states the percentage of time allocated to budgeted staff does not exceed 100% across all AmeriCorps grants. It's not required, it's just something that sometimes will save a little bit of clarification down the road. So I encourage you to enter that type of content just to provide a little bit more clarity. And eGrants will help you populate the information in here. There's specific fields that you will enter to include the individual title name and then the percentage of time and the annual salary. In Section 1B, that is the personnel fringe benefits, you will identify the type of fringe benefit and the cost for each staff. The budget includes pre-existing FICA, health and life insurance, and retirement line items that you can then edit as appropriate. And you'll enter additional lines such as state unemployment insurance or workers' compensation as that's appropriate. Your fringe benefit cost should align with the salary lines. That is, it should only include staff that are included in the personnel expenses section, and those should be calculated in alignment with Section 1A. If the benefit is more than 30% of salary costs, you must justify that cost by listing those benefits separately. So in other words, rather than enter fringe benefits at 41.65% of total salaries, you would break it out and it might read health insurance at 24%, retirement at 10%, and FICA at 7.65%. You can either break those out as, here's all of our health insurance costs, here's all of our retirement costs, here's all of our FICA, and so on, or you can align it with the individual staff in Section 1A. So if you've got your project director and a project assistant in the Section 1A category, then you would do the appropriate fringe for those two positions in a similar manner. Section 1C is the travel section, and that is divided into local travel, which is travel within the project service area shown in item 12 of the 424 face sheet, and your long distance travel, and that's travel that occurs outside of the service area. In both sections, you should include the purpose of travel and the type of travel. That's whether it's ground transportation, air, lodging, a per diem, and so on. The number of trips, the number of staff that are traveling, and you want to make sure that the calculation you are using is clear and simple to follow. You should include only travel costs for staff listed in budget category 1A and who directly support the grant activities described in your application. And please note the budget guidance in section D6D of the NOFOs, which states that applicants must include a line item for the project director training expenses. And that would often be your travel to go to whatever the training event is. Know that you may budget mileage at a higher than the federal reimbursement rate if that mileage rate follows your organization's policy and it's justified in the budget narrative. And by that justification, it could be as simple as just adding a comment in that line item that says based on organizational policy, or something appropriate. Section 1D is the equipment section, and equipment is defined as tangible, non-expendable personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. If it's less, the expense goes into the supplies section, no matter what the threshold is that your organization uses to define equipment. And if you're budgeting equipment costs, you must show the unit cost and the number of units with the purpose of the equipment. Likewise, in the supply section, category 1E, you will show the type of supplies and their respective costs and individually list any single items costing $1,000 or more. Section 1F is for contractual and consultant services, and it includes all contractual and consultant services. You will itemize each contract or consultant and provide a brief justification of the need. You can convey that the costs are reasonable and necessary by adding a daily or an hourly rate, or putting in there what your annual contract fee is, including any of those type of details in your justification. The section should include any services that are documented by a contract, such as equipment maintenance or accounting services or training consultants. And then section 1I is your other volunteer support costs. And that's a bit of a catch-all category for those project expenses that don't neatly fit into the other categories. In this section, you must include national service criminal history checks for employees or other individuals who receive a salary or similar payment from the grant. This is a pre-existing line item that you will then edit as appropriate. If you do not include these costs in your budget, please make sure to explain how the costs are covered or that the checks are already completed. This section may also include line items to cover costs for training, evaluation services, recruitment expenses, and other expenses that don't fit into sections A through F. In addition to the direct costs, section 1 includes a section for indirect costs in 1J. And indirect costs that I referenced earlier are those general or centralized costs that support the project. They don't include project-specific costs, and they may be included in an organization's indirect cost rate agreement if one exists, or calculated using a de minimis rate. So before we move to section 2, I want to take just a few moments to look at how you would calculate the indirect costs. And then I'll pause to see if there's any questions about section 1, and then we'll look at section 2 of the budget. So as I said, there are 2 methods for calculating indirect costs in an FGP or SCP budget. And please be aware that this is one of those pieces that varies from the guidance that was available on the website. The FAQs referenced only the federally approved indirect cost rate. There are 2 rates, that federally approved rate and the 10% de minimis rate. So if an applicant has a federally approved indirect cost rate, they must use this method, and that approved rate agreement constitutes documentation of the indirect costs. E-grants will direct you through the population of this information, and you will specify the rate type, that is whether it is provisional, predetermined, fixed, or final. And then you'll also supply the rate and the basis on which the rate is calculated. That is whether it's based on salaries and benefits, all direct costs, or some other basis. Applicants will then follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. And if you're budgeting for less than the maximum, you will note the percentage claimed in that description in e-grants. You must also enter the details of your approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in e-grants using the guidance in the NOFOs under section D6B as in boy, not by sending a copy of the current agreement to AmeriCorps as is noted in the application instructions. And please do make sure that the budgeted rate that you use in your budget is the same as the rate details entered in e-grants, and that indirect cost rate agreement details that you're using a current rate, that it hasn't already expired, that you're using the most current and accurate information. Alternatively, organizations may use a de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs. And it's important to note if the de minimis option is elected, then the organization must use it consistently across all of the organization's federal awards. As an alternative to using either of these methods, applicants may charge these costs directly, providing that the costs meet the allowability standards outlined in the uniform guidance. So with that said, I'm going to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions related to budget section 1.
Hi, Tracy. We've had a couple of questions come in. One asked if you could go over the difference between the cost of equipment and supplies again.
Absolutely. That was a real easy one. And if you need to reference it, it is in the application instructions. Well, actually, it's not quite as detailed in the application instructions. But yes, equipment is tangible, non-expendable personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. And then supplies are basically anything that doesn't fall into that description. So if they have a useful life of less than a year and an acquisition cost of less than $5,000 per unit would be your supplies.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
We've gotten a couple of questions about indirect costs. Can you explain what is meant by indirect costs?
Absolutely. So as we went through the direct costs and you looked at those different cost categories, your personnel expenses, your fringe benefits, your travel, your supplies, your contractual services, criminal history checks, those are all costs that you can allocate directly to this grant. That is, you can say, okay, I've got my project director allocated at 100% and a project assistant at 75%. And they're going to travel this far, this many times, and they have these fringe benefits and these criminal history checks. You can allocate it as a percentage, as an actual dollar amount. It's very related to what is in your program narrative. The indirect costs are those costs. It's basically the cost of doing business. It's the cost of running your organization, your rent, your utilities, your executive director and administrative's time. It's not necessarily individuals or individual costs that you're going to allocate to the grant, although you certainly can if you have a process for determining what percentage or what amount is allocated to this award. But in general, you can say these are just indirect costs. They support my program. I often will use the analogy of a beach house, and you see that that house on the beach that, you don't want to build it right on the sand because the waves are going to come crashing. It's going to knock into it. When the flooding comes, there's just a mess. You need something that's there to support it. So you build that house up on stilts, and those indirect costs are like that stilt. It's there to support everything else. If you didn't have your facilities, your rent, your your copier lease and your executive director and all of that, you couldn't do all of the other things that you're budgeting for in here. So it's really all of those support expenses. And if the organization has a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, and that is provided by the organization's cognizant agency, so that's the federal agency that gives you the most money in federal dollars, you would negotiate an indirect cost rate with them. Then you could use that rate or anything up to the maximum of that rate. And if not, then you are able to use that 10% de minimis rate, which is the 10% of modified total direct costs.
Thank you. Trying to choose one more. We got a couple of questions. Can you speak to whether things like supplies can be defined by dollars per month on the budget?
Yeah, that goes back to, excuse me, goes back to when I was talking about using historical information. And if traditionally, you use, I don't know, pick a number, $50 of supplies a month. You can certainly use that as justification and your basis. And so in your budget narrative, you would say supplies calculated at X number of dollars per month based on historical information, as simple as that. But that's something that you would want to look at your records to make sure that you are actually using some type of historical information. Otherwise, then you're just going to have to take a shot and say, okay, I think that I might use this many pens and this much paper and it costs this amount, and kind of make that guess. But that's where that piece about the budget being flexible, and sometimes we realize what we planned for 6 months before a program started is not necessarily what really happens. And we realize we've got to make a budget modification. And, so if you find that you budgeted for something very different, then that's when we can talk about a budget modification.
Awesome, thank you. And one more indirect cost rate one. Can you please explain cognizant agency and if AmeriCorps as an agency has its own rate?
So again, cognizant agency is the agency that gives the organization the most federal funding. So if you're getting federal awards from 5 different federal agencies, it's the one that's giving you the highest dollar amount in all of the annual awards. And you would work directly with that organization to determine the indirect cost rate for your organization. So we as a federal agency do not have a rate. It is a rate that we negotiate with the grantee organizations based on what you're proposing as your indirect costs.
Thanks, Tracy.
Certainly. Anything else?
That's pretty much it for section 1.
Okay, perfect. Then let's move on to section 2. And that focuses on volunteer expenses, and it includes 2 budget categories. As I said, category 2A includes lines for the foster grandparent and senior companion volunteer stipends only. And eGrants has pre-populated the annual stipend calculation of $3,132. Applicants need only enter the number of volunteers and the stipend totals for the AmeriCorps and the grantee shares and the total amount of the line item. So the totaling those 2 components. And again, this is one of those situations where the application instructions include incorrect information. They have an old annual rate of $2,766, and that was based on an hourly stipend of $265, and that was raised to $3 last spring. So the annual stipend that you will include in your budget is the $3,132 that is in eGrants. The budget section also includes category B, other volunteer costs. And this category is pre-populated with lines for meals, uniforms, insurance, recognition, travel, and physical examinations. And you'll enter the associated costs for these line items in the same manner you did for section 1, including details such as the number of volunteers covered, the cost per item, the mileage rate, whatever it happens to be to justify the expense. Please remember that insurance for volunteers when on assignment is a required line item, the details of which are outlined in the regulations. And you will find a link to those regulations on page 5 of the NOFOs. Volunteers may also be reimbursed for costs incurred while performing assignments, such as transportation and supplies, providing that the costs are outlined in the memorandum of understanding that's negotiated with the volunteer station where the volunteer is serving. The last section of the budget narrative is the source of funds section. And in it, you won't list budget sections or budget line item cost. Rather, you will enter the source of those resources that are covering the specific line item expenses in the grantee share of the budget. So as I said before, the source of funds section provides details for any grantee share of cash or in-kind resources included in the budget. And applicants will enter these details from budget section 1 into headings and click the link to enter the source of matching funds that's shown here. Once you click that link, a new screen will open for you to enter the source. Please be aware that there is a source of funds category for both section 1 and section 2, and you will use either or both depending on where you budgeted resources as part of the grantee share, if you budgeted resources as part of the grantee share. Once you open the window for the source of matching funds, you will enter each source of matching resources separately, including a brief description of the match, whether it is secured or proposed, the dollar amount of the resources, the match classification, again, that's that cash or in-kind piece, and then the source type, whether it's private, state, local. And I caution you to make sure to update this section as well as if you use it, the indirect cost section, after you make any budget revisions so that it reflects all changes. You know, these pieces that are based on other information in the budget, they are often neglected, and you go back and you make a couple of modifications in the front end of the budget and you forget to update the indirects or the source of funds. And then when we're looking at it, we're looking for that information to match exactly, and it doesn't because of overlooking the update in here. So as I said before, this source of funds total must equal the total amount of resources in the grantee share of the budget exactly. And that's why it's important to go back and update it all the time. When complete, the source of funds section might include content that is similar to, Mike, let's see the example. There we go. And if you look at this, you will see that it only is including the source of match, not the specific budget sections or the line items that are covered by the matching funds. And it provides the required detail. It notes whether the resources are secured or proposed, if it's in-kind or cash donations, and if it's provided by a private or a government entity. As long as we are discussing matching resources, I want to remind you that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or your required match. Again, if you're not sure whether a cost is allowable or not, the uniform guidance is the best place to find that answer. This is also a good time to discuss the excess funds column that applicants may use to report the amount of grantee share resources in excess of the required match. Applicants are not required to utilize the excess column, but you may do so if you choose. And this column may include the cost of activities such as fundraising, which are unallowable on the grant budget. The cost of the excess funds should not, however, be included in this, excuse me, in the source of funds section. Let me say that again. The source of excess funds should not be included in your source of funds section. All right, that is section 2 of the budget and the source of funds section. So let's break again and see if there's any questions related to either of those two pieces.
Sorry, I was on mute. We got a couple of questions. Trying to make sure that they're relevant to the section. I know we got a couple of questions I was trying to answer in the chat about corporation funded versus non-corporation funded, and that refers to our old name.
Correct. Yeah, any reference to corporations, CNCS is all now going to be AmeriCorps Seniors.
I see a question here. It says, can we put percent of internal trainer in the personnel cost?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Sorry, can we put percent of internal trainer in the personnel cost?
Yes, so when you are entering any cost in the personnel section, excuse me, the way that the eGrants content is set up, it will ask you for a percentage of their time. Assuming it's a full-time employee, they're going to ask for what is the percent of the full-time equivalent. So if you've got someone on staff and they're devoting 10% of their time to the project, then you would enter the 10% and you would enter whatever their annual salary is.
Yeah, the rest of the questions don't have to actually do with section 2. Should I save them for the end?
We can do that. That sounds great.
All right.
So let's move on to some pointers about budgeting, and that begins with guidance to check and to double check your work to eliminate any erroneous information. The NOFA and the application instructions outline any budget restrictions and regulations. Please make sure to follow them. And remember to use that version of the application instructions and the FAQs updated after January 12th, 2021 to guide your work. Your budget should include all required costs, such as costs for staff and volunteer criminal history checks and transportation recognition and insurance costs for volunteers. Your budget narrative will demonstrate how you are supporting your budgeted match with a source of funds section that includes the required details and equals the total budgeted match exactly. And as a reminder, applicants will not be held to the required match referenced in the NOFO, but if you include match, you must document the source of the matching resources and align it with the budgeted match. And as much as possible, and I know that eGrants has character limits for some of the fields, so that makes it a little challenging at times, but as much as you are able, the budget narrative should provide details, including the purpose and accurate calculations in whole dollars and exclude unallowable costs, both those unallowed in this competition and those unallowed by the regulations. And just a little pointer that I've picked up over the years, I often recommend that applicants use a $0 line item to enter additional clarifications if needed. So you can just enter a new line, and then when it comes to entering the actual cost, you put 0 for the CNCS share, 0 for the grantee share, 0 for the total, but that gives you an extra space where you can give us some narrative just to provide some additional clarification. And again, a reminder to please have someone check all of your calculations before you submit. Finally, and most importantly, you should ensure that your budget is aligned to the program goals in the application narrative, including any miscellaneous contingency or undefined budget amounts may adversely impact your application status. Again, I will stress the benefit of involving your team and someone outside of the team in the budget development and review process. Having just one more set of eyes on it really does make a big difference. In addition, before you submit your application, please make sure that your organization has an active registration with the System for Award Management, and that is accessible at sam.gov. If you're applying for the first time, I recommend that you apply early, as it may take a while to activate your registration. And please know that SAM is a free service. Organizations should never ever pay for a SAM registration. Further, know that applicants must maintain an active SAM registration throughout the application process. And if awarded an AmeriCorps Senior Grant, you must maintain an active registration throughout the life of the grant. And a link to the SAM Quick Guide for Grantees is in section D3 of the NOFOs. If required, also please make sure to submit your organization's operational and financial management survey using the process outlined in section D7B as in boy of the NOFOs. Also, please make sure that your organization's most recent single audit is on file with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and your Form 990 is submitted to GuideStar if applicable. And finally, if you have one, please be sure to enter your current federally negotiated indirect cost rate details in eGrants using the guidance in section D6B of the NOFOs. And finally, AmeriCorps is aware that on occasion, applicants experience challenges with our eGrant system. eGrants automatically performs a limited compliance check to validate the budget, and it may result in a warning or an error message. Some of these messages prevent you from submitting your application, so you should be aware of the differences and the related actions. For instance, when you receive a warning, you can move forward, but the application may not be compliant with the guidelines. On the other hand, an error message will not allow you to move forward until you correct the error. And you must resolve all errors before you can submit your application. If you experience a challenge other than a warning or an error message, you should contact the AmeriCorps hotline right away. The number is shown here on the slide, and a link to the help request form is at the bottom of most eGrants pages. I want to draw your attention back to these bullet points that I shared earlier. I encourage you to keep this checklist nearby as you develop your budget and your budget narrative, and frequently consult it as a budget development guide and a quality assurance checklist. Many budgets require extensive revisions, and it's often in part because the applicants don't follow the points outlined here. You will save yourself a great deal of follow-up effort by checking your proposed budget against this checklist before submitting it to AmeriCorps. So that's all I have to share. I hope you found this instruction a helpful guide for developing your FGP and SCP budget and budget narrative. And I encourage you to review the content from this presentation multiple times before submitting your application as part of your quality assurance process. And with that said, Ann, I'll toss it back to you to check if there's any additional questions that we can answer.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tracy. So we've got a question here. Should the number of volunteers used to calculate the narrative be only for year one of the project or for the total over 3 years?
Your budget is a one-year budget, even though you're looking at this as a 3-year project and we're looking at a 3-year grant award. This is a single-year budget. So please do make sure that all of your costs are just for that single 12-month period. Great question.
Okay, the next question has to do with training. Should an additional line item be included for a director's training, or can that be included under long distance travel?
That can be included in your travel section, and I would just make sure that you're noting that it is for the director, just so that anyone who's reviewing this is clear that you have met the requirement to include that training component.
If background checks have already been done or might otherwise be required by the applicant, while you might include $0 in the line item, should an applicant include the contributed cost as part of their non-federal match?
You can. You can also leave that as a 0. And that's where you may recall that I mentioned about if you're not budgeting costs for this, uh, that's where you'll want to say why you are not, because these have already been conducted, and you can just put a statement in here that, existing staff with current checks in place, or, same with the volunteers, they've had them conducted elsewhere. So you have the flexibility to do that either way. What's really important, and especially since the required match is not going to be assessed this program year. That's why I'm telling you, you don't necessarily need to put it in there as match. But what is really important is to show us that all of your staff, all of your volunteers that are noted on the budget do have accurate checks and current checks, rather.
Great, thank you. I've seen a couple of questions that are asking about recognition. So in the chat, folks, I am providing a link to the Manage AmeriCorps Seniors Grant page. You'll be able to access some of the tools, including examples of costs that are allowable for recognition. I've also seen a couple of questions asking about the session and whether or not it's being recorded. The session is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides on the competition website, and I'll include a link to that in the chat as well. I see another question here. Is there a deadline or a closeout date that we can ask direct questions about the proposal? So you can continue to send your questions, or you can come back tomorrow to our training to ask questions. And then you can also continue to send your questions to the competition mailbox 2021 FGP SCP at cns.gov. I see a question, is $260,000 the maximum or the minimum? So it depends on the number of VSYs, those volunteer service years, that you are requesting. $260,000 is the maximum if you are requesting $260,000 is the maximum if you're requesting 40 VSYs, so 40 volunteer service years. Let's go through the chat to make sure we didn't miss anything. Are there any last tips that you want to share, Tracy?
I will just again go back to that checklist. I think that is the biggest tip that I can share, is to have that to go through the application instructions and the NOFO, and make sure you're just reading that very carefully, paying close attention to everything that is required and those things that are not allowed. And then to check and double check for accuracy. Check that math, pass it off to your best friend, your cubicle mate. Well, I guess we all don't have those anymore. But pass off the budget to anyone who is unfamiliar and just say, does this make sense? Can you understand what I'm doing? And I think I will tell you in particular, I get very confused with travel calculations, because you've often got lots of different things in there, numbers of people, numbers of miles, numbers of trips. So just take caution to make sure that all of your calculations are both complete and clear and correct.
Thank you, Tracy. One last question I see in the chat. Is there a maximum number of VSYs we can apply for? There is not a maximum number of VSYs, so apply, or you may request what you think is best for your community and what you can effectively manage. I'm not seeing any other questions. Well, Tracy, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and teach us more about the budget. This was really helpful for me. Hopefully it was helpful for all of you in the audience today as well.
Great. Well, thank you for including me, and I thank all of our attendees for the great interaction. I appreciate it. It's always helpful to see so many questions coming through and interest, and I wish you all good luck with this.
Good luck, everyone. We'll see you back tomorrow afternoon. Bye.